Just one small correction. Although I would be proud to be a Palestinian author, I'm an Israeli Jewish author. But who knows, maybe in the future joint state, these definitions would be less important. That's my dream in any case.
Our dream also.
Your dream also.
Yes.
So we have a common dream. What I would like to do in half an hour and leave half an hour for questions and remarks and comments is to talk about the idea of ethnic cleansing as a past and present reality in Israel and in Palestine. I think it's important to make a distinction when one wants to assess the Zionist project in Palestine and later the State of Israel between the achievement of the Zionist movement with regard to Jewish communities around the world before and after the Second World War as one story, and the impact that that movement had on the indigenous local population on the other. It is only if you understand how contradictory these two achievements, or these two impacts, if you want. The second one is not an achievement. These two impacts are, you understand the complexity of the reality in Israel and Palestine. From a Jewish perspective, the Zionist movement was a solution for the predicament of the Jews in Europe on the eve of the Holocaust, a predicament that indeed turned into a catastrophe. And therefore, when one looks historically at a political movement that suggested to the Jews that Europe is not a safe place and that they should leave and find another place to survive, one cannot blame for people talking positively on the Zionist movement from that perspective. From that perspective, the idea that Jews on the eve of the Second World War in many parts of Europe were a community under the danger of extinction and extermination is definitely something that gave credence to this idea that Jews should look for life elsewhere. However, when you look at the same idea that the Jews should look for a safer and better place before the Second World War, and that they choose a place when someone else is living in it, the noble project of salvage, of survival, becomes a project of colonialism, of dispossession of another people. And this tension between, on the one hand, saving the Jews from the catastrophe that awaited them in the Second World War, and the catastrophe that the Jews brought upon the Palestinians in Palestine, is, I think, the story in a nutshell. Now, it is important to understand that the Zionist movement was not the only one offering a solution to the predicament. In fact, the vast majority of the Jews found the United States and Britain a better solution to the danger that awaited them inside Europe. But this is less important, I think, now, because the Jews in great numbers, not so much in the beginning of the Zionist movement, but later on, opted for Palestine as the safe haven from a Europe that looked more and more dangerous. But I think it's important to stress that the problem was not coming to a place where someone else lived. The problem was not so much coming to Palestine. If you know the history of the Palestinian reception or reaction to the early Zionist settlers, you would know that the reception was welcoming. They looked at the Jews as a group of poor European Jews who didn't know how to cultivate the land, who didn't know how to survive in the reality in Palestine, and they were helped in their early stages when they arrived in Palestine. The problem was that from 1912, I would say, 1913, just on the eve of the First World War, the Jews who came to Palestine did not come with the notion that they are looking for a safe haven. I really think the Arab world, unlike Europe, the Muslim world, unlike the Christian world, was always much more welcoming to people who were under danger. Think about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. When the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, it was the Ottoman Empire that received them with open hands, not Christian kingdoms around Spain. So I do think that if the Jewish immigration, if you want, into Palestine would have come as an immigration of human needs, of people who would say, we are experiencing a survival or existential danger in Europe, and we need a safe place here in Damascus, in Cairo, and so on. I really think that the climate in the late 19th century and early 20th century Palestine and the Eastern Mediterranean would have been, was such that it would have been possible to absorb these immigrants as people who are seeking refuge and survival. But already in 1905, and much more so in 1912, 1913, the immigrants stated very clearly, first among themselves, later broadcast it quite loudly outside, that their aim was not to find refuge. They came to redeem an ancient homeland that was occupied by someone else. And this is a different mission. If you today in the Czech Republic would find out that there are 500,000 people or 100,000 people who would ask you to come to Prague because they are feeling in danger wherever they are, and you would say, all right, we'll accept you. And then you will find out that actually they want to come to Prague because they think that Prague belongs to them and you have no right to be in Prague, you would begin to experience what the Palestinians have experienced. Only if you understand that. If you think about a group of refugees and immigrants that come with an ideology that says, the place I am coming to is my place. It always had been my place. And anyone who is in that place before me has no right to be in that place. And they spoke very clearly about it. And what is quite surprising, at least to me as an historian, is the fact that quite a few Palestinians knew that this is what the early Zionists were thinking and planning. It's a different question for a different lecture. Why did not the Palestinian political elite act when it knew about it? Why did it wait so long before it reacted? But that's not the topic of my speak tonight. What is important is to understand this idea of someone who is a settler, who is a colonialist, or even if you don't want to use these very negative terms, is an immigrant, who comes to another country believing that this is his home country, which is bad enough, but also believes that anyone who is on that home country is an alien, occupier, who took by force something that belongs to him. You can understand some Palestinians who would say, there are such poor Jews from Eastern Europe, they are only 1% of the population, why should we be afraid of them? So they think that this is their home and we have no right to be there, but they're just 1%. You can see why it takes a lot of ingenuity on both sides to understand that this is a real threat. But the matter was not intention. The intention of the Zionist movement from the very beginning was to create a Jewish state instead of the Palestine that existed. A state that would have no Palestinian in it. Or, if you want, in more pragmatic terms, to have as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. This intention, this vision, this strategy was there from the early Zionist project in Palestine. What was not there from the very beginning, the means and the resources to implement this vision. Since the Zionist project was not just about dispossessing the Palestinian, it was also about creating a new Jewish nation and a state, the early stages of the Zionist project were not devoted to the question, what should be the fate of the Palestinians? It was far more important to obtain international legitimacy, to build the foundation for a future state, and only when these initial stages were achieved, with the British betrayal of the Palestinian through the Balfour Declaration, and with the arrival in Palestine of the Jewish bourgeoisie from Central Europe with their money and their assets, and the recruitment of the American Jews, then the Zionist leadership felt that it has completed successfully the first stage of the Zionist project. International legitimacy and deep foundation for a future state. And this happened more or less in the early 1930s, when the Zionist community in Palestine was 1/3 of the population. When they became 1/3 of the population, they felt strong enough and free enough, if you want, to consider what should be their strategy towards the Palestinian population, which was the majority of the land, which was the native population, which was the indigenous population of the land. And in 1933, 1934, with the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, the Zionist leadership felt even more urgently the need to answer the question, can we have a Jewish state with such a Palestinian presence in Palestine? So I think in many ways the events in Europe accelerated the decision-making on the Zionist side on this question. And it is from 1937 onwards that the Zionist leadership talks very clearly about its plan to systematically dispossess all the Palestinians from Palestine. Ben-Gurion, the head of the community, writes to his son Amos in 1937 in a famous letter that we will have to expel the Arabs, but we will have to wait for the right opportunity. He meant for a war or for the end of the British mandate. And that came 11 years later, when the British government decided in February 1947 that it had enough of the mandate. It could not see any benefit from continuing controlling Palestine, which was not a great strategic asset for the British Empire. They decided to leave Palestine and refer the problem to the United Nations. That was the moment that the Zionist leadership decided that it has to move up or accelerate the implementation of the vision of 1937. How to make Palestine a place without Palestinians. And it's the tragedy of the Palestinian community is that the Palestinian leadership was not prepared for that eventuality in 1947. It was destroyed by the British in 1936 to 1939 because of the Arab Rebellion. It was fragmented from within, and its politics were expropriated by the Arab League after 1945. So there was not much of a decision-making on the Palestinian side. Nobody knows in history what would have happened if. I don't know what would have happened if the Palestinians would have been better prepared for the events of 1948, but that doesn't matter. Historically, they were not. So it was easier, actually, for the Zionist leadership to implement its ideas. A year after Britain decided to leave Palestine, around March 1948, the Zionist military and Jewish command decided on a plan called Plan D, to systematically sweep the Palestinians out of Palestine. The plan was adopted on the 10th of March 1948 by the high military command of the Zionist movement. That is, 2 months before the creation of the State of Israel, 2 months before Britain has ended officially its mandate on the 15th of May 1948. And immediately after the plan was adopted, the Jewish forces started to cleanse the Palestinian cities, towns, and villages. By the time the British mandate ended on the 15th of May 1948, half of the people who would become Palestinian refugees were already refugees. All the urban space of Palestine was emptied from Palestinians by May 1948, and quite a lot of the countryside was ethnically cleansed by that time.